Thank you again, everyone, for joining the panel. So, my first question for all of you is, as some of the audience might know, there's an open letter from Future of Life Institute. It's been signed by over 30,000 people, including Elon Musk, and this letter calls for a 6-month pause in the development of AI systems more advanced than GPT-4. So my first question to each and every one of you is, would you or have you signed this letter? Why or why not? So let's start with Konstantin.
I didn't sign the letter. I appreciate the concerns of the people that signed it. They are valid concerns. But I felt that the specific recommendations given in that letter are either not enough, they are ineffective, or they are basically more like to create an impression at the public rather than to actually address a real issue. And we can talk, if you want, about the specific recommendations.
Got it. Yeah, maybe we'll do a little bit of a deep dive shortly, but let's first hear each answer.
So I have not. I don't plan on it either. Mm-hmm. I think that I sympathize with why they would be concerned about the AI that's being created, but not everyone in the AI space is always doing it for the right reasons. And so there are people who will not stop and would be creating AI that may be designed to do exactly the harmful things that they're worried about. And what we end up doing is by sort of saying, you know, as the good guys, if we put a 6-month moratorium on it, what we're doing is giving a 6-month head start to adversaries of people and governments who are not on our side. And I think we just need to be practical and realistic about who is in the AI space and what they would do with a 6-month head start.
Interesting. And when you talk about these potential adversarial actors, is that primarily other governments or non-government actors or both?
It would be both and the gray zone that exists in between them. Governments are very good at funding organizations that are not completely independent of themselves. And that's true of every government. And some of those organizations do good work, some of them do bad work. But in the ones that I'm concerned about, there would be independent people that could potentially be parts of terrorist organizations that are utilizing AI. You have quasi-government organizations that are using AI and generative AI for misinformation and disinformation. And you also have governments themselves that are just sanctioning a lot of updates in AI that could be potentially dangerous. So I would say it's all three.
Got it. Okay. Anna?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. No, have not signed it. And coming from security and defense background, I do understand that facing a fear is actually bringing you more opportunities to finding how you can challenge the threats. And so we have to understand that in AI space, we have been working as industry in self-regulatory framework for many years. So what it provided to us as companies is to come together, unite, and develop those standards and best practices to actually safeguard AI. And when such letter comes out, so it actually diminishes what we have been doing for years. So there is another way how we can safeguard our customers, users, societies from malicious use. Mm-hmm. Whether it's governments, whether it's private organizations, individuals, or proxies, those that work on behalf of governments. So again, facing the fear is actually our
better option.
Yes.
Yeah, not taking a 6-month pause. Nick?
Yeah, I'm aligned with my fellow panelists for similar reasons. Obviously, the bad actors. Obviously, good actors would stop, but that doesn't stop. Can you hear me now?
Maybe it's, yeah, we need another mic. We'll have to pass that one around.
There you go. I'm aligned with my fellow panelists for the main reason being that if good actors stopped research and training larger models, more powerful models, that doesn't mean that the bad actors are going to stop. But the main reason is that if you look at any sort of novel, nascent innovation technology in the past, from aviation to automobiles, etc., it's through allowing bad things to happen. You know, if there weren't that many airplane crashes and investigations and innovation, we wouldn't have flying be so safe today, right? So if you halt AI research, you're not going to magically figure out how to prevent bad things from happening when you resume the research and the training. So that's probably the primary reason, is you have to allow innovation to just take its course and regulation and so on to kind of follow.
Got it. All right, so you've heard it from 4 really brilliant thinkers. The unanimous answer seems to be no to a 6-month pause. But there were a lot of recommendations also in that letter. Konstantin, you alluded to those. I'd like to hear from each panelist as well, whether it was in their specific recommendations or just in other things you're aware of in the industry. Is there a particular regulation or step or something that we should or shouldn't be doing that you feel very strongly about?
Right, so one of the recommendations was to increase research funding for AI safety. And of course, as a researcher, I really like that recommendation. I hope it's adopted. But there were also recommendations that were, in my opinion, rather ineffective. Like, there was one recommendation saying you should regulate access to computational power.
Right.
So how will this be enforced? And isn't this kind of a very strong thing to do? If I want to do some experiments, I have to convince some agency that they should allow me to access Amazon's cloud or NVIDIA GPUs. It doesn't sound right. Or there is another recommendation that there has to be a third party that will be certifying these systems. How will they do that? I mean, even if you know all the data that are used for training, even if you know the architecture with all the transformers and all of that, you can still not really be certain about the emergent capabilities of these systems. So I hesitate to say this so openly, but I think some of those recommendations were mostly meant to produce a big splash of public attention. They are not really going to help in any real way. They will probably actually slow things down for the good guys, as others said.
Yeah, and become a bureaucratic nightmare, possibly. Justin?
I largely agree. 2 of the things that stood out to me, one of them was the role of third-party certifications. For me, some of the greatest threats that AI poses to us today are threats to democracy and the degrading relationship that we have with institutions in our own states. It has been quite easy because a lot of the bureaucrats haven't been as good at their jobs as we would have liked them to have been during and after COVID. So we are doing a bit of a favor to them in that regard. But when you institute third-party certification bodies, there becomes a risk that they act as a non-democratic or extrajuridical body that can decide what is and is not within the boundaries in ways that ultimately just make more burdens on the system. So it's not just stifling innovation, it's also creating a muddiness in terms of what we decide as countries are codified as rule of law. And that is the boundary that we really need to be working within, is one that's very clearly defined for everyone. And in that regard, it kind of brings me to the second point that I have on this, which does implicate not just that letter, but also like the EU AI Act and the other efforts towards regulation in the United States right now. I think that there is a very large risk that these regulations, although by and large I do think that they are good, they're not just well-intentioned, but I don't think that these are some sort of nuclear bomb against innovation. I think that ultimately things will work out pretty well, but there is a risk that the way that we're going about regulating and the timing and nature of the letter, I think, are evidence to this, that what we're going to do is we're going to be regulating on products and not on principles. And I think that in order for us to have healthy innovation throughout Europe and the United States, we need to be able to regulate on principles and not on product. We don't know what the next AI product is going to be. So it's impossible to regulate things that we don't know exist. But if we regulate the possibility of their existence out of the potential space of our future, then we're really only hurting ourselves, because either we've missed a great opportunity, or two, we've given that opportunity to someone who probably shouldn't have it. So I think that the biggest thing that we can do to keep in mind in terms of regulation now is really to regulate on principle. And those principles can be the guardrails that we set as a society and as a collection of societies that can guide that. So regulating on principle and not on product, I think is really the best way forward.
Okay. One quick follow-up to that. Who should decide what those principles are, and how should that be decided?
Yeah, and I think that's the beautiful part about the chaos that we call democracy and institutions and international relations. My grandfather was fond of saying something that democracy doesn't give you the government you want, it gives you the government you deserve. It's a hard pill to swallow sometimes, but I think that there's some wisdom in that here as well, which is that democracies are always chaotic. Right? You get emergent consensus that no one is really happy with, but everyone is happy enough with that it's okay. And I think that incorporating one, AI regulation more clearly into a general democratic process, and two, to facilitate that, better AI education into the general public so that they are more informed as participants in the world that's affected by AI, that we're going to be able to get an emergent consensus, much like we cannot solve the question of what's the best corporate tax rate. Every country can kind of have their own. We know that there's general guardrails. We don't like it if people say 0. We also don't like it if people say more than 50. So there's going to be a lot of experimentation, and I think this actually goes to Nicholas's comment too. That experimentation, that sometimes somebody getting a little bit wrong is more safe than not getting it wrong at all.
Got it. Okay, very interesting. Anna, any kinds of regulations that, or potential regulations that you feel very strongly about that we either should have in place or should not be doing?
Yeah, I totally agree that we have to build regulations on values or principles, understanding where we want as democracies to come, for example, in 10 years. In terms of how we protect our citizens, protect copyright, IP rights, how we mitigate the potential abuse of technology to meddle in elections and to control, manipulate our information ecosystem. And it's interesting about the approaches how we can do it. So if we compare, for example, European EU AI Act, it does provide some sort of principles and values. If we look into US and UK market, it's more UK market is more inductive approach, where the changes are happening in existing regulations, for example, copyright, intellectual protection. If you look in US market, so it's interesting the shift of building partnership between companies and public sector, bringing them together around those voluntary commitments. How we do it in Ukraine, and I'm part of AI Committee at Ministry of Digital Transformation. It's taking exactly this approach of public-private partnership, bringing AI committees that is comprised of researchers, academia, civil society, and industry representatives and policymakers, and actually build this understanding of values, right? Mapping those problems, and then delivering the roadmap to ministry. And I think this new term of public-private partnership and those voluntary commitments that we can sign and test, experiment as a companies, because we have to understand that capacity, technological capacity of AI belongs to private sector. We all work with those models, and it's up to us also to create those standards that can, for example, provide transparency of digital content generated by AI. But as we, as industry players, have to code it, have to create open codes and release it. It's not policymakers. So that's a clarity and practice. We have to understand that we have work together, put those values that, of course, we want to protect the human rights, the growth of AI. We have to protect, and we want to protect our democracies, but really technical tools is up to us in this ecosystem of partnership we can build. And I think the last point is two questions, is accountability and clarity. There is a lack of clarity on regulations right now, lack of clarity for companies how to implement and comply. And I think we have to avoid that mistake from other previous regulations, and how we do avoid it is actually bringing tech companies to the table. And tech companies, I don't mean big tech, because if regulation only hears big tech, we're creating bottleneck of access of smaller companies to the market. And I represent the generative AI industry that is led by smaller companies, and we've already put resources into those safeguards, working with big tech. But we have to really remember that today, technology driven by AI is not represented solely by big tech. And accountability, where users, consumers can go and ask for clarity over their data is stored, how it's secured, how they can protect their likeness. So I think those two questions are really important, how we shape regulations.
Okay, very interesting. Nicholas?
Yeah, so many points. We have 13 minutes left, so I'm going to try and pick the most appropriate one. But I would be very much against a top-down regulatory approach. I think in this particular case, meaning AI, it's very different to any other AI, any other technological revolution. It's got to be a decentralized approach. It's got to involve all the actors. In other words, you cannot just have regulators. You know, I love the idea of bringing, you know, regulators and technologists together. But in addition to that, I think a lot of why this letter got so much attention is because there's this fear of the unknown, right? I mean, I've been in the AI space forever, and Konstantin will tell you the same thing. A lot of times, you know, we don't necessarily know why a model actually works, right? We understand how we've architected it, built it. Now, how is the average consumer going to truly understand and appreciate, or even know that the decision they've been faced with or the advice they've been given has been made by AI? So if they're informed, and this is the one area where I think regulation should come in, is that if an AI decision impacts me in any way, I should know. And there should be an element of explainability and transparency, and I should have a way to have a voice, so feedback, right? So some form of reinforcement learning, feedback to the model that also gets collected by some body that's put together by all the actors in the ecosystem. That kind of approach I'd be very much for, because this letter was purely a publicity event. You know, most of the people that signed it had already built a large language model. At least 3 that I know of, their next startup that they're actually working on now is in the AI control, AI alignment space. So, you know, it's very difficult to take it too seriously. So there's a lot more I wanted to say, but I'll stop there because we've got other questions to get to.
Okay, very interesting. So we've heard just a few different kinds of approaches. So just a quick follow-up question to anyone who wants to chime in. Who should be leading the way? And are we doing enough now? And if not, who needs to step up if we need to take some extra steps? So I'll let anyone who has an opinion on that speak.
I think the quicker that groups of like-minded startups can actually get together to try and lead a lot of the discussion around AI ethics, the better. 2 reasons. One, the startups are where a lot of the innovation is going to be happening in what's going to be spoken about a year and 2 years, 3 years down the road. The other one is big tech companies generally, and more established companies, are well-financed enough that they can afford lobbyists, which creates a conflict of interest between the technology that they're currently sitting on and the regulations that they could propose. Because one way that you can always make sure that your legacy dinosaur systems maintain market dominance is by getting the government to just over-regulate your competition out of existence. So I am very skeptical about the ability for a top-down government approach to do this, because there are so many moneyed interests in every government that the tech companies that are there and the close relationships between very established companies and governments sometimes is great because it has the experience of building a large company at the table. But the negative part of it is that sometimes it also seeps in this sort of more nefarious way of stifling innovation in order to maintain a market dominance for someone who's more established in the market. So I think those sorts of smaller confederations and build that from the ground up is the quicker we can do that, the better.
Yeah. Okay.
If I can follow up on that.
Yeah.
Because that's exactly what we've been trying to do in generative AI space, right? To come together from generative AI, what I mean is companies that create deepfakes, so the synthetic media. It's a part of language models. So for already 4 years, we've came together, reviewing the cases where we would not like that our technology would be used, for example, for disinformation purposes. But we lack resources to invest in really deep research on watermarking, because watermarking is actually a big tech question and research question, how to get to the balance and trade-off between invisibility and robustness. So what we've done, we've partnered with Adobe, its Content Authenticity Initiative. We've developed this open source standard, and we're the first audio company, synthetic audio company worldwide with features that implemented that. But the question is, if policymakers and governments want to reach to that transparency level, where this funding is? So, because again, I'm mentioning the generative AI is heavily represented by startups that not often put such people as I am resources into, head of ethics and trust and safety. That's basically a classic position for established big companies. And I think we have a big gap in that of top-down requirements that you have to provide transparency, but bottom-up, how do you support this ecosystem of developing really feasible technical tools and codes that can support that goal?
Got it. Okay. So shifting gears a little bit so that we can cover a little more ground. One of the main questions that I've been hearing even from speaking with people at the event is it even possible to control AI, given that we're talking about systems that are processing information at such astounding rates that we're not capable of? I know, Konstantin, you mentioned the need for investing in more research. So I'm just curious what the opinion is about, or how you would explain to the average person how it's possible. How can you regulate a system that you can't fully predict?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's the not $1 million question, it's the many millions dollars question. There is very good research that is going on, and it has exactly that goal of how do we actually both predict and control what these systems can do, right? And I do believe that we will do it. It's just that everything is happening so fast, and of course, to build something, it's kind of faster than to be able to write all the math behind it and understand everything about it. So we're lagging behind the developers. The developers have already built incredible things, and now we're still trying to figure out exactly how they work. But we will do it, and I have no doubt about that. The thing is, it has to be something that happens in parallel, right? If somehow we slow down the research part through all of these regulatory actions, or even the creating fear in the public. Whenever you create fear, people do not want to support that research anymore, right? I have seen this happening with other research areas where funding agencies, they're like, no, I don't want to touch that because the public doesn't approve that kind of research. So I hope that this will not happen also with AI, because we actually need AI research more than ever before, I think.
To keep ahead of it.
Yes.
Got it. Okay. Curious if anyone else has a thought on that, yeah?
Yes, as Demis Hassabis says, we are solving intelligence, so intelligence can solve everything else, right? So safety in AI is a problem that's going to need a higher level of intelligence, because it's a technology that is not developing contiguously and linearly. It's skipping around, it's jumping around. The rate of development is exponential. I don't think, but to answer your questions, I don't think a bunch of smart humans in the room can control AI or build deterministic systems that can control AI. It's got to be a series of models that look at multiple dimensions of what control and alignment represents. And having those systems learn and become smarter, obviously you have humans in the loop and you have the ultimate decisions made by humans. But for us to do it, we need that radar system that's able to see what we can't see. And we need to keep developing more of those. And to your previous question, Caroline, who ultimately is going to drive this is the consumer. You know, aviation wouldn't be safe today because if it wasn't, people wouldn't fly, and then people, you know, the industry would have died. It's the same with AI. So if we are vigilant and we insist on knowing, you know, what data was this model trained on, is this decision from an AI system having that explainability, and you make those demands, eventually the systems will be built to control it, but we cannot. And this is why I'm against this notion of just writing a codified regulatory framework and saying, there you go, that's going to sort the problem out. Mm-hmm. That's a pipe dream.
Right. All right. So, before everyone gets too nervous, I guess I'd like to hear your thoughts on, some popular fears that people have AI, like, for example, the Skynet scenario, AI becoming sentient, AI, we're talking about controlling AI. What does that really mean? Is there anything that you would want to alleviate nervousness or fears around when it comes to popular conceptions about AI and kind of where it could go and why we need to control it? Anyone?
I'm not sure that I would prefer actually if everybody in society gets engaged in this conversation. So I don't see my role so much as trying to convince people not to worry about it and go back and do their usual things. I mean, the world is changing because of AI. It will change in the most radical way you have seen in the last, I would say, 50 years. So everybody has to be engaged in this conversation, has to be very thoughtful and read about this and
become more literate.
Yeah, absolutely, because it is going to change everything.
Yeah. And then the key is not to stop everything for the reasons that we heard at the beginning, but to invest in more research and for the public to be as educated about it as possible so that they can also participate in decisions about it. Justin?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of worries that people don't need to have yet, but it's actually not a bad thing to be worried about them generally.
Right.
Because at the moment, there's a lot of people talking about artificial intelligence without realizing that psychologists don't have a really good definition of human intelligence.
Or sentience.
So, yes, exactly. And people are talking about, we're going to have conscious AIs. We don't even know if we have conscious humans.
Right.
And I think
we cannot prove or disprove any other being's sentience.
Exactly. And given the lack of intelligence we often see in the world, there's a question as to whether or not we really need to be worried about the artificial version quite yet.
Or the human.
Yeah. So I would say that worrying about the Skynet scenarios and things like that, they can often be fun on the one hand. They're very philosophical exercises, almost thought experiments. But I also think that they can be useful because getting out ahead of this now and being worried about it before it's too late, I think there is a certain amount of healthy concern there. But being realistic about where we are and understanding the gap between where we are and where the danger lies, I think is something that changes that conversation from being more about conspiracy and science fiction to being something that's more practical and healthy.
Right.
And I think the solution is human, Carolina. AI is trained on data produced by humans. It's the digital footprint of humans, right? The algorithms are built by humans. If you want better, safer AI, create better humans. Raise our kids with the right values and ethics and morals, and have that be part of the programs where that people are learning AI. Have ethics and morals be a huge part of that, and it'll take care of itself.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would add here because today is 2023, and actually it's really great that for the past, I think, 2 years we have started discussing AI on such stages and safety of AI. It was not a practice 10 years ago when we had a lot of social platforms, media social platforms, and we've seen how they could be used as manipulative tools. So we as humans already transitioned to the point when we understand more about technology and what we can expect of it. And I think we are in a point right now when all startups and companies can already integrate that understanding. And I think it's really interesting book by Brad Smith, Tools and Weapons, when he suggests that technologists should already study with humanitarian studies together. So when you're building a code, it's for you to understand the impact of what you're creating, and impact, not just market impact, but on society and individuals. And I think when this realization comes into the hearts of companies, we'll be in a much more predictable world.
Yeah. All right, so we're at the point where we just have about 5 minutes left for questions. So I will turn to the questions from the audience. So the first question, which had the most votes, we've touched on a little bit, which is, can we rely on the AI industry and government to regulate AI safety when the regulators themselves rely on AI to set guidelines? So we've touched on this a little bit, where we've heard from the panelists saying that there needs to be a partnership between the private and public sectors. There needs to be participation from the general public. But when we talk about the regulators themselves relying on AI to set the guidelines, does anyone have a comment on that?
I'm going to say something half kidding, but also completely serious. When you look, at least in the United States, which is obviously a very big leader in the AI industry, the age of regulators in the United States right now is retirement in most other countries, right? So when you look at the hearings that they're having in DC about regulating the tech industry, they're asking Mark Zuckerberg, how does he make money? And you realize that they don't understand the basics of social media. They don't understand the basics of computing. They don't understand the basics of AI.
Yeah.
So in terms of this question, maybe it's actually a good thing that AI is helping them to write the regulations, because AI knows more about AI than they do.
Interesting. All right. What are your thoughts on AI generated from stolen art, and that no one is talking about this?
I could take it. Well, these models are obviously trained on data. No one really releases the specific data they're trained on, but absolutely, a lot of the diffusion models are definitely trained on art that's out in the public. And there are definitely copyright breaches, but we have laws in place for that. And there are a lot of lawyers putting deposits on mansions and yachts that are aiming their machine guns at OpenAI. The amount of lawsuits that are coming their way for copyright breach is immense. And that's what I'm talking about. Having these things happen is going to make the next company that goes along to think a little bit more carefully about
where
violating
they get their
copyright.
data.
But we don't need to create new regulation. Copyright law exists. It's well established.
Yeah. Okay. How does the horizontal adoption of AI affect workers' engagement at work and labor rights? So AI and labor, what are some of the ethical implications we have to think about?
Look, I will probably touch upon actor strike, because that's exactly where in the domain where we're working, because we provide voice cloning for Hollywood studios and actors, and also provide for small digital creators to scale their voice. And it's an interesting question, because the problem in itself, it's not AI, it's historical relationship between studios and actors. It's how the contracts were developed and where the likeness, to whom the likeness belongs. And unfortunately, this question, it's not strictly about AI, but about actually revising and reviewing how we can have a control of our likeness. I think it's directly the question of copyright and IP. And So what we execute is that when we create someone's voice, we require permission from the voice owner. If the person is deceased, we require permission from family members or estate members. And that's something in industry we're promoting and we establish as a best practice. And I think there is a lot of misconception about that AI will completely substitute work, because AI also provides you to scale, for example, in our case, your voice, to get more project, because like, a voice actor always attached to a voice identity that I'm having now, but I can then perform in many other voices. So I think it's about balanced discussion, where AI is an assistive tool and where the likeness can be stripped.
Okay. Let's try to answer just a couple more questions. So one is about the current EU regulation, and will it have a negative effect in developing new AI products, especially since non-EU countries may not have these restrictions? So based on the current regulation, is it already potentially going to have a negative impact?
Yes.
Okay.
Particularly insofar as it concerns the European Union. One of the interesting carve-outs in a lot of the regulation that's happening is the research regulation. One thing that Europe is really good at doing is I mean, relative to many other places in the world, is funding research. So carving out a research regulation, but then really tightening the noose around the actual commercialization, basically allows Europe to serve as America's tech incubator. The companies are going to be developed here in terms of the tech, and the IP is going to be, the know-how is going to be generated at some of the top European universities. And then they're going to take that IP, they're going to take what they've developed as researchers, and they're going to take it to the United Kingdom, and they're going to take it to the United States to get investments and grow in a larger market. So if the European Union is serious about tech sovereignty, they need to really rethink some of the nuances of what a globalized system looks like.
Yeah. Is there any particular regulation that's having that effect or will have that effect?
So on the one hand, that the loopholes for research, right? So that research doesn't really have to have the same regulations and what you can and can't do as commercialized AI. One of the things that's there is in the AI Act, they have different levels of sort of concern. And what qualifies as a high-risk AI system, I think should be more clearly defined, because one of the things that we're hearing from Brussels is not the European Union is going to lead in innovation. They're saying the European Union is going to lead in regulation. And what needs to happen is, I mean, if you don't have innovation, what are you really regulating anyway, right? We need to foster the innovation, and the regulations can come hand in hand with that. But if everyone's just worried about trying to get new stamp, bureaucrats, Europe has plenty of stamp bureaucrats. That's not what we need. I think that really what we're creating is a great IP pipeline. As an American, it doesn't bother me as much as maybe a lot of other people in the audience. But I think it's a real concern. As someone who's now made their life and residency in the European Union, I don't necessarily want to see my hometown in Slovakia gutted by brain drain because it's just easier to chase money in the United States. I'd rather see this stay in the local community, where I'm raising a child and hopefully he will have a future where it's going to be much, much, much more prosperous than it would have been 20 years ago in Slovakia. And I think key to that is being ahead of innovation in a changing economy and world, and not necessarily being the leader in regulation in that world.
Absolutely. All right, I think we're out of time, but thank you all very much for your very great insight. I'm sure there's another hour of this discussion that we could really dive into. We didn't even touch on wartime versus peacetime, which we had on the agenda, but for the audience, please feel free to reach out to any of the panelists with follow-up questions, and let's have a big round of applause of thanks. Thank you.